Ranks of spears flashed, horses stamped, and the air smelled of iron and smoke. This is Albulena. How, in 1457, roughly 8,000 men turned a mountain into a weapon and routed an invading field force that contemporary accounts place at around 40,000. They came like a tide, a long, confident column of banners and drums moving through a fog-choked Albanian gorge. The story begins with a man who knew both sides of two worlds. Gjergj Kastrioti, called Skanderbeg by friend and foe alike, had once been groomed inside the Ottoman system, taken young as part of the Dev Shirme, trained in the arts of war, even serving in campaigns under the Sultan. He returned to Albania not as a subordinate, but as a leader who reforged clan loyalties into a living resistance. By the mid-1450s, Skanderbeg had become the central figure of Albanian defiance, a man whose small, rugged principality had repeatedly frustrated Ottoman efforts to pacify the mountains of the Western Balkans. Across the sea, Mehmed II, the conqueror, had remade the map of the Eastern Mediterranean. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 announced an empire on the move. The Sultan's attention turned to consolidating control in the Balkans. Steamrolled by victories elsewhere and mindful of a restive pocket in the mountains, Ottoman commanders sought a decisive blow. The immediate spark for the 1457 campaign, according to chroniclers from both sides, was not only imperial ambition, but personal betrayal. Hamza Kastrioti, a nephew of Skanderbeg, declared for the Sultan. Reports describe him joining the Ottoman expedition that year, a wound to Skanderbeg beyond the military calculus. A fissure of family loyalty opened into political treachery. Whether Hamza's motives were ambition, fear, or calculation, contemporary sources agree on the result. The Ottomans assembled a large multi-ethnic force, Janissaries, Anatolian cavalry, Syrian archers among them, and marched west with the intention of extinguishing Albanian resistance. If the Ottoman column brought numbers and organization, Skanderbeg brought knowledge of the land and a willingness to turn every slope, ridge, and ravine into part of a defensive machine. He did not meet the empire on open ground, where weight and mass would count. Instead, he chose the narrow gorge, known in the chronicles as Albulena, a place where a river carved the hills into a constricted throat, where a long column would be forced to pass single file, where the guardians of the mountain could observe, prepare, and strike. Preparation was not an abstract plan. It was labor that blended the work of soldiers and villagers. Scouts moved like ghosts along the ridgelines, reporting the rhythm of the enemy's march. Blacksmiths and carpenters hammered in secret. Women and older men rolled stones and dug pits under cover of night. Fields became workshops for the manufacture of simple but lethal devices. Pits camouflaged with woven branches and earth, long logs patched with ropes and greased to slide, and heavy boulders polished and set for the instant they would be unloosed. Archers were placed in staggered positions along the slopes, their strings drawn and arrows prepared to rain down upon any trapped column. Cavalry, not in the massed charges of a plain, but as mobile strike units, waited in hidden folds to bite at flanks and finish a disordered enemy. In the days before contact, the valley lived two faces, the appearance of normal life maintained to avert suspicion. Beneath that, a seething preparation, every trench and anchor point tested. Skanderbeg's men moved silently, speaking in clipped orders, practicing the timing of logs and the placement of pits. The narrowness of the gorge itself was an ally. It canalized an army as a river channels water, forcing it into places where it could be dammed, diverted, and shattered. When the Ottomans entered the gorge, they carried confidence like armor. Contemporary reports describe a column stretching for miles, banners snapping in the morning air, the serried ranks of Janissaries and the more loosely arranged cavalry, making for a formidable rolling mass. They had at their disposal experience and the weight of imperial logistics. What they did not have was the full knowledge of the terrain they traversed, nor the fact that the valley they trusted as passage had been converted into a machine of ambush. Signs of trouble appeared in the small things first: a slackened caravan, a stray horse that stumbled, a sound like a swallow of stones. The column's front advanced in cautious formation, the vanguard probing ahead. Then, in sequence, and with the grim certainty of prepared violence, the trap detonated. The first phase was denying escape. Men at the ridge points pushed massive trees and toppled anchored timber. Whole lengths of trunks set to tumble were released by hidden ropes and wedges. They fell with a brutality that shook the earth and sealed the gorge behind the leading Turks. Boulders, once freed, rolled with irresistible momentum, smashing into wagons and horses, blocking paths, and creating an instant labyrinth of rock. The rear was not yet aware precisely what had happened. The column, long as a rope, was now kinked and constricted between banks of stone and fallen tree. Pits, camouflaged until the last breath of wind, received horses and men who misstepped. Contemporary accounts tell of animals plunging and carts overturned. In the confusion, momentum turned against the Ottomans. Above them, archers loosed volleys, not as an artless hail, but with calculated stagger. Arrows aimed at exposed necks, horse flanks, and the unprotected faces of the men in the valley. The sound of arrows striking mail and wood mixed with the groan of trapped horses. Stones were not simply rolled. Men hurled them, and miners' makeshift slings and devices sent missiles into the press. The gorge, once a conduit, had become a funnel of death. The narrow ground nullified the traditional Ottoman response. Cavalry charges require space. Formations need room to deploy. Janissaries were superb in discipline and volley fire, but in a choked, uneven ravine, their formations broke apart. When Albanian cavalry struck, they did not attempt a substitution of mass and weight. Instead, they chose timed slashes, small, focused attacks that widened panic. Skirmishers, hidden along the ridges, descended in sudden, coordinated bursts that left the larger force disoriented. Chaos breeds mistakes. Contemporary chroniclers, Venetian observers and Albanian scribes alike, describe how the Ottoman command structure, stretched long and confused, could not respond with centralized control. Orders sent down the line arrived late, or not at all. Units, separated by the tumbling trees and the blocked passages, found themselves isolated. Some detachments fought desperately to break out. Others, caught head-on by flanking charges, were pushed into the river or clung to sloping banks. The narrow defile amplified noise, the clatter of breaking timber, the shout of men trying to rally, the dull thud of bodies and armor. Skanderbeg kept reserves for precise moments. He did not squander his force in a single rush. Instead, he exploited a rhythm, strike to unbalance, then press where the enemy was vulnerable. Night fell over the gorge like a curtain, and with it, a different theater of war opened. Exhaustion and cold reduced the clarity of command. Makeshift campfires flickered amid rubble, torches sputtered, and the darkness hid both act and intent. Ottoman soldiers, cut off and confused, tended to the wounded, tried to regroup, and by some accounts grew complacent after surviving the first shocks. That complacency proved fatal. At a prearranged hour, Skanderbeg ordered the final, decisive action. Torches were lit and used as weapons as much as beacons, fires set to rolling tar and dry brush, placed to send smoke into the enemy's eyes and to illuminate the valley for a coordinated attack. Albanian cavalry, which had been stalking and probing the flanks, struck in concentrated waves. Archers shifted their aim to those attempting to flee or wedge their way past obstacles. The sound of trumpets and horns rose in the darkness from the Albanian side, not as a crude cacophony, but as a signal synchronizing attacks along the gorge's length. Gjergj Kastrioti tried to break out. Contemporary narratives report him commanding a portion of the Ottoman allied contingent in a desperate bid to force a way through the obstructions. Yet the valley had been closed like a trap. Every probable avenue of escape had been anticipated and rendered perilous. Hamza's attempt, whatever its motives, failed to restore order. Instead, it became emblematic of the larger collapse, a figure who had defected to the invader, and who now sought to lead that very force out of doom, was unable to find safety where the rest of the column could not. As the night attack intensified, morale eroded. Soldiers, already battered by trapped movement and constant missile fire, gave way to panic. The disciplined columns became a scattering of men trying to outrun the terrain. Those who tried to hold lines were cut off by sudden cavalry charges. Those who fled were funneled into pits or edged into the river. Fires spread in spots, and the valley took on an apocalyptic light, flashes of orange and the silhouettes of men and horses against rock. Yet this is not to romanticize violence. Contemporary descriptions emphasize the human cost: bodies piled, families bereaved, the sound of wounded men left to die in the cold. Victory in Albulena came with blood on the stones. By dawn, the gorge presented a grim stillness. The smoke hung low, and the river ran sluggishly, darkened by mud and the debris of battle. Skanderbeg's men moved through the wreckage in small, methodical detachments, gathering the wounded and removing the fallen where possible. The victory was decisive in its immediate effects. The Ottoman column, as contemporary sources claim, suffered heavy losses. Survivors limped back toward the routes of retreat, bearing accounts of a battlefield turned against them. Yet chroniclers of the time differ on exact casualty numbers, and modern historians caution against fixed figures. The title's numbers, about 8,000 Albanians against an Ottoman force reported at roughly 40,000, are the framing claim carried in many accounts of Albulena, but they must be read as reported estimates rather than precise censuses. The larger significance extended beyond the valley. News moved slowly across Europe's courts and port cities, but it moved with a moral. An emperor's army could be disordered by a smaller, resolute foe that knew its terrain. Skanderbeg's reputation spread as both a military tactician and a symbol of resistance. He did not overthrow the Ottoman state, but he fashioned a narrative compelling enough to redraw perceptions. For a time, Albanian resistance became not merely a regional annoyance, but a cause célèbre in Western diplomatic circles. Venetian messengers, papal envoys, and mercenary captains took note. The victory underscored that the Ottoman advance, though formidable, was not inexorable. What happened at Albulena illuminates a tactical lesson that remains clear across centuries. When facing a numerically superior foe, the choice of battlefield can invert advantage. Terrain served not as a passive backdrop, but as an active element in the Albanian strategy. A narrow gorge neutralized the Ottomans' ability to deploy cavalry effectively and compressed them into kill zones where artillery and massed formations could not function as intended. Simple engineering, pits, rolling logs, prepared boulders, multiplied the effectiveness of a smaller force. Precision in timing, local intelligence, and the integration of non-combatant labor into military preparation turned civilian knowledge into a force multiplier. Discipline among the attackers was undermined by surprise and environment, while the defenders preserved cohesion by fighting on prepared ground. Yet the story also carries the human contours of cost and betrayal. Hamza's defection didn't just provide the Ottomans a commander, it produced a moral and political wound for the Albanians that made the campaign intensely personal. At the same time, the victory at Albulena did not guarantee permanent independence. It was a striking check that delayed Ottoman plans, bolstered the morale of Skanderbeg's alliance, and carved a space for diplomatic maneuvering. The prince's legend grew accordingly, mingling fact with the kind of embellishments that time often weaves into heroic tales. For the Ottomans, the defeat at Albulena was a sobering episode. Empires absorb such reverses without disappearing, but they learn. Tactical adjustments, increased reconnaissance, and a deeper respect for local geography often follow when imperial columns are humbled in narrow places. For the men who survived, the memory of stones and pits and night fires likely lasted a lifetime. For the villagers and blacksmiths who carried the weight of the preparations, the victory was both relief and sorrow. A defensive triumph earned at sacrifice. In the aftermath, accounts vary in tone. Some chroniclers emphasize the cunning of Skanderbeg and the ingenuity of a tactical design that turned a terrain into a fortress. Others dwell on the brutality of combat and the suffering of common soldiers caught in the crush. European letters carried the news, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes cautious, yet generally impressed that a raised mountain people could so severely damage a great power's field army. Ottoman records of the engagement are notably terse in some respects, reflecting perhaps both the embarrassment of the defeat and the routine of frontier warfare where such reverses were not unheard of. Albulena's legacy is not simply a single sentence in the annals of the 15th century. It is a study in asymmetry, how local expertise, preparation, and the will to resist can meet overwhelming force with something more than resistance, with active annihilation of the opponent's advantages. It is a reminder that the geography of a land can be as decisive as the number of troops, that ambush, when prepared with patience and secrecy, can transform a valley into a sword. When historians look back, they place Albulena within the broader arc of the Ottoman-Albanian wars. A campaign of raids, sieges, and finely fought actions rather than a single decisive knockout. Skanderbeg's skill lay in his ability to choose the terms of engagement repeatedly, to force larger enemies to fight on ground that favored his experience. The Battle of 1457 did more than win a field. It struck at the aura of Ottoman invincibility and elevated Skanderbeg to a symbol of resistance whose fame reached far beyond the Adriatic hills. The human cost tempers any glory. Graves dotted the slopes. Families counted the missing. Those who survived the immediate fighting carried scars, and the memory of comrades lost in cramped rocky spaces. Victory and sorrow are braided together in the valley's memory. That mixture of triumph and price is perhaps the most accurate way to read Albulena's place in history. If there is a single strategic takeaway from the gorge, it is this: preparation and intimate knowledge of environment can convert a numerical deficit into tactical superiority. The Albanians did not outfight the Ottomans in the sense of greater numbers or heavier arms. They outfought them by setting conditions that nullified the Ottomans' strengths and amplified their own. Timing, secrecy, and the integration of non-traditional combat measures, pits, rolling timber, controlled fires, made the difference. Discipline, in the sense of coordinated, patient application of these measures, was as important as bravery. As for Hamza, his role remains a cautionary emblem about the dangers of internal division in the face of external pressure. His defection may have helped precipitate the Ottoman response, yet even with his presence, the invading force could not overcome the valley's prepared defenses. It stands as an instance where personal choices folded into greater strategic outcomes, shaping events in ways that would reverberate beyond a single campaign season. Centuries later, Albulena retains the power to teach. Military historians study its phases: the denial of lines of retreat, the stacked defensive obstacles, the use of elevation for missile fire, the timing of a night offensive. Students of statecraft note that empires can be surprised by local will and geography. For the general audience, it offers a narrative with all the elements of drama: betrayal, ingenuity, dramatic assault, and the hush of a dawn that follows terrible violence. At the gorge itself, silence has a memory. Rocks remember the paths where wheels once rolled. Ridges carry the ghost sounds of thousands of feet. The story of those who dug the pits and hauled the logs is as essential to the tale as that of the commanders. Victory at Albulena was as much the product of craftsmen and villagers as of skirmishers and lancers. That communal aspect is part of why the victory carried such weight for the Albanian cause. It was not merely a military success. It was a demonstration that collective action could resist a looming empire. The title's simple claim, that some 8,000 men defeated an Ottoman force reported at about $40,000, captures the essence of the battle's drama while also demanding careful reading. Those numbers, repeated in chronicles and later histories, reflect the impressions of observers and the chronicler's desire to mark a contrast between a small, determined force and a seemingly overwhelming invader. Modern historians cross-reference such figures with logistical realities and the propensity of medieval sources to exaggerate. Still, whether the numerical ratio is exactly as recorded or somewhat different matters less than the fact that a smaller, well-led, and territorially savvy force inflicted a stunning defeat on a much larger army, thereby altering perceptions and the course of localized events. By dusk of the following days, the ripples of Albulena had reached courts and ports. Ambassadors spoke of a raise in Skanderbeg's reputation. Military thinkers took notes. The Sultan's commanders, though capable and resourceful, had been taught a harsh lesson about underestimating the leverage of terrain and local organization. For the men who had carried the day, the victory bought breathing space and a sharper legend. For the Ottomans, it was a costly reminder that even a powerful state could find itself in an unforgiving mountain trap. Finally, return to that fog-choked gorge where the campaign began. Imagine standing on a ridge at dawn, the air cold and thin, stones still stained and the river moving slowly through the narrow course. The mountain holds its secrets, but the outline of the battle persists, where logs once fell, where pits gaped shut, where torches had flashed like small suns in the dark. In that silence, the tactical truth is plain. The land, shaped and prepared, can be made into a weapon. Resolve, organized and patient, can bend the course of events. Ambushes are not merely moments of violence. They are deliberate transformations of the environment to achieve a strategic end. What remains to ponder is this. History is full of seemingly unequal contests, where smaller forces used calculation and landscape to strike larger powers. Which ambush, across centuries, do you find most brilliant, and why? Share your thoughts below. And if you're into battlefield tactics and lost victories, subscribe for more deep dives into moments where terrain, timing, and tenacity reshaped history.